The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Theda Skocpol, professor of sociology and government at Harvard University and co-author of a recent article, along with Alex Hertel-Fernandez, How the Right Trounced Liberals in the States. Theda Skocpol, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Nice to have you with us as well. You know, in 5 of the last 6 presidential elections, more people voted for the Democrat. Yet, Republicans control the governorships and especially the legislatures of most of the states. Is it just a matter of Democrats forgetting to vote in state elections, or is there some other reason?
Well, the Republican sweep across 2/3 or more of the states is really a story of the 2010 and 2014 midterm elections. Before that, there was a lot more balance, not perfectly balanced, but Democrats controlled many more state legislatures, many more governorships. I think we know that during Barack Obama's presidency, the midterm elections have not gone well for the Democratic Party, and it is largely a question of lower voter turnout, particularly in 2010, by Democratic constituencies, younger people, minorities, many of whom were discouraged by the deep economic downturn at the time. And on the other side, there was an energized set of constituencies on the right of the Republican Party. And I'll just flag one other thing. Older people switched their voting patterns from 2006 midterm, before Barack Obama was in office, toward being less inclined to vote for Democrats in 2010 and 2014. And since older people vote very reliably, they go to the polls, that made a big difference.
That's an interesting one that I hadn't heard. You also make the point that what has changed in recent years is that state laws are often written by big business interests. How do they accomplish this?
Well, this has been a long time in the making, that conservatives have worked through organizations, particularly like the American Legislative Exchange Council, to build ongoing relationships with business interests, both national business interests and businesses with a particular interest in regulation or taxation or spending in the states. And they bring them into task forces where they often sit side by side with people from conservative think tanks, advocacy groups, and those task forces write model bills that members of the state legislatures, mostly Republicans, not entirely, but mostly, then take home and introduce in their legislatures. This is a process that's been going on for quite a long time. And it's going on even more, of course, when Republicans take majority control or supermajority control in more states.
Now, if the right wing uses the states to enact an anti-regulatory or anti-union agenda that it can't get through Congress, and I'll be the devil's advocate here, what's wrong with that? I mean, don't Democrats do that when they can, and shouldn't they just do more?
Well, there's nothing wrong with any group of citizens or any, for example, interest groups mobilizing in American politics. There's nothing new about it. Under our Constitution, people have the right to organize, they have the right to speak out, they have the right to vote, and these days they have the right to give money without very many limits. Now, I think there can be some questions when legislation that's being written into model bills and hurried through legislatures, sometimes without any hearings, very suddenly, is passed if that legislation is not popular with most of the citizens in that state. I mean, I'll give you an example. In the state of Michigan, which is my native state, a Republican governor and Republican legislature very hurriedly passed right-to-work legislation that hobbled the rights of unions to engage in collective bargaining, public sector unions in particular, later private sector too. Well, that's not popular with the people in that state. Most people didn't want it, and it wasn't something that the politicians promised to do in the elections either. So you can raise questions about how legitimate that is in a democracy. But on the whole, my answer as a social scientist is everybody has the right to organize, and maybe if you don't like the other side organizing, you should do a better job of organizing yourself.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Theda Skocpol, professor of sociology and government at Harvard University, co-author of a recent article along with Alex Hertel-Fernandez, How the Right Trounced Liberals in the States. Who exactly are the people and organizations that are funding the state-by-state march to the extreme right? And what are some of the more outrageous examples of bad legislation?
Well, we call the set of three organizations by now, in recent times, the Troika. There's the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is not a recent creation. It's been growing up for decades. It enrolls state legislators as members and brings them into task forces with advocates and with businesses to write those model bills that I talked about. It took ALEC a little while to discover how to do that effectively, but they do it very effectively now, and they've been able to introduce thousands of bills and get them passed in many states. And then secondly, there is a nationwide network of ultra-free market think tanks called the State Policy Network. Every state has one or more of these think tanks. They're funded by right-wing donors and foundations, and they work with ALEC. Sometimes they sit on those ALEC task forces. Sometimes they issue op-eds or do lobbying or testimony in the legislature on behalf of particular bills. And then most recently, since 2004, 2005, there's an organization in the Koch network, the David and Charles Koch, the multi-billionaires, called Americans for Prosperity. It has state-level organizations all over the country in 34 states, and Americans for Prosperity can get in touch with conservative citizen activists to give an extra push on behalf of legislation that ALEC and the State Policy Network affiliate are pushing, or they too can write op-eds, or they can run ads, and they can intervene in elections. So once you put together those three prongs of the Troika, that's a lot of energy and ideas that back up conservative Republicans who want to pass certain kinds of legislation. I already mentioned that in many states they've passed curbs on public sector union rights that most citizens don't really believe are a good idea. In many states, the Troika has gotten behind new rules to make it harder for people to vote without showing an ID, or trimming back early voting days in ways that probably everybody involved understands are going to make it harder for minorities and young people, lower income people who might vote for Democrats to actually exercise their right to vote. So those are a couple of examples. There's also a lot of activity from this Troika in blocking the expansion of Medicaid to near poor people. We did a study that showed that they're very active, and sometimes they're even able to defeat the Chamber of Commerce that would like to expand Medicaid in a state, take all that money for hospitals and healthcare businesses. The right-wing Troika weighs in against it and has persuaded quite a few Republican legislatures in states like Texas and Florida and other places to not take this money from the federal government that provides health insurance to near poor people.
Mm. Is this underground movement, if you will, is it like a third party?
Well, it's not all that underground. I mean, I think if you go and you read the regional newspapers in the states where these kinds of battles are occurring, they're going to be reporting that the organizations we just described, I just described, ALEC, Americans for Prosperity, state think tank, combined with other conservative groups and sometimes business groups, are behind these bills in the legislature. So it's not necessarily secret. Does it amount to, it works through the Republican Party, this troika of organizations. So I wouldn't consider it a separate political party. I would say it's intertwined with the Republican Party, and it's helped to pull the Republican Party toward the far right on a lot of key issues.
Is it part of the problem that conservatives are more prone to stick together and raise money for one organization while progressives are perhaps too splintered and compete too much for the same dollars?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that we talked about in our article on how the right trounced liberals in the states is what's happened when liberals have tried to launch these cross-state networks of legislators or of think tanks. There is no left equivalent to Americans for Prosperity, although you might consider the unions to be an equivalent. What has happened in again and again is that liberal donors have scattered their money among different attempts, and above all, they've been sort of quick to quit funding things if it takes them a while to get off the ground. Now, I think the organizers of the new State Innovation Exchange 6 would argue that that's changing now, that they are trying to launch one concerted effort and to bring all the donors together behind it. And that may be true, but it's going to take a patient and sustained effort of the kind that we haven't seen in the past on the left, because the left tends to think that the presidency is the key prize and not pay as much attention to what's going on in the states.
Is it just about changing the rules? I mean, because a lot of these, they're not. It sounds like they're breaking the law, but they're not. I mean, they're within their legal rights what they're doing. So what do progressives do to sort of combat this takeover of state government by the right-wing ideologues?
My answer is always going to be the same. If you don't like what one side is organizing to do, go out and organize better on your side. I'm not in the school of thought that thinks there's some magic wand that we can wave to take money away from those we don't agree with in the political process. I don't think that's going to happen under the American Constitution. And so I think it's better to concentrate on getting out the vote and organizing on our side.
That's what we say on this show all the time. Sit back and listen, then get up and fight. Theda Skocpol, professor of sociology and government at Harvard University, co-author of the article, How the Right Trounced Liberals in the States. Theda, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks, I've enjoyed it.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Last year's gubernatorial race in Virginia was narrowly won by Republican Glenn Youngkin. An elite Wall Street multimillionaire, he was going to lose until he discovered a right-wing racist bugaboo called critical race theory. Glenn suddenly turned into an anti-CRT attack dog, fomenting parental fear and promising to sweep all teaching of the theory out of Virginia's classrooms. But golly, CRT was not actually being taught in any of the state's public schools. To help Youngkin dodge this inconvenient fact, a partisan front group called Metric Media created 25 fake news sites in Virginia that ran nearly 5,000 articles during the election, spreading the CRT bugaboo. While these papers have no subscribers and no significant readership, They allowed demagogues like Youngkin to use such lies in speeches, ads, etc., laundering them as facts by simply saying, as reported in the such-and-such newspaper. With success in Virginia, Metric Media and other fake sites are pumping out CRT sludge in Florida, Texas, and other states with gubernatorial races this year. Indeed, the lie has become its own political industry, with such billionaire extremists as the Koch brothers pumping money into it. This is why America must have actual local newspapers, widely available and affordable either in print or online, that have the community commitment and journalistic resources to do the job of nurturing truth and democracy. Otherwise, we're ceding news to the shams and scams that are inevitable under hedge fund profiteers and networks of partisan hacks that already dominate wide swaths of America's media landscape. This is Jim Hightower saying journalism is key to democratic self-government, and we should start investing in it, providing public funding for local independent watchdog reporting. Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
Hello, David Korn, and welcome back to the Bill Press Pod.
Good to be with you, Bill.
Congratulations on the new book, American Psychosis, a historical investigation of how the Republican Party went crazy. Now, David, first of all, let me just ask, psychosis, I mean, that's a pretty powerful word. I mean, severe mental disorder,
Well,
that's the Republican Party today?
Well, when you are detached from reality, I mean, that's psychosis. When you don't understand or acknowledge reality, when you believe something that is not real. If you look at the Republican Party right now, its raison d'etre is the lost cause of Donald Trump's election. That is, that it was stolen from him. That is a big lie. We know that. But yet millions of Americans adhere to this. And it's become the motivating force of the Republican Party. You had not just thousands of people at January 6th, but you have still, all this time later, millions of Americans who say the election was stolen, that Joe Biden did not win legitimately. There is no reason to believe that. There's no evidence. Every time I hear Marjorie Taylor Greene or somebody else get up there and say the election was stolen, I go, my God, don't you have some obligation to present evidence to back this up? We know that during the January 6th hearings, one of them, Rusty Bowers, the Speaker of the Arizona State House, said that Rudy Giuliani told him in the post-election period, we have no evidence, we just have theories. And so the fact that this has been so firmly absorbed by millions of Republican voters and encouraged by not just Donald Trump, but most of the Republican leadership is a form of political psychosis.
Well, the key point of your book, at least that I took away to take away from your book, David, is that this psychosis didn't start with Donald Trump, right? First of all, it's been very common among the Republican Party of the presence of these extremists. But even beyond that, I mean, you go back to, this is part of the backstory of America, right? We're a nation that kind of has always been fueled by conspiracies and paranoia and wackos. Back to the Salem witch trials, for example.
Right. I mean, there's a chapter in the book that just talks about how paranoia and conspiracy theory have long been part of American public life and American politics. And that's been true on both sides, not just, the Republican side. You had the Illuminati scare of the early 1800s, then the anti-Masonic conspiracy theory that led to the anti-Masonic party. You've had anti-Catholicism that's been, part of a conspiracy theory that was been used by politicians. But what I really, the bulk of the book, the book really takes off after World War II, and what I describe and chronicle is that the Republican Party for the last 70 years has consistently exploited and encouraged extremism, and that could be paranoia, bigotry, nativism, all sorts of far-right fanaticism. That the party has courted it, has encouraged it, and to different degrees and in different ways. And that Donald Trump hasn't invented anything new. He's just put it center stage. You can go back to McCarthy in the early 1950s, and what he did was to claim that America, the American government, the U.S. government, was being run by people who were Soviet agents, who were plotting to destroy America and hand it over to Moscow. I mean, he named names. He said that the leader of this plot was George C. Marshall. He was the Army Chief of Staff in World War II, helped win the war. He helped save Europe with the Marshall Plan, and he was at this point Secretary of Defense. And here's Joe McCarthy saying he is literally in charge of a cabal that has the express purpose of destroying the United States from within. Not that they're wrong, not that their policies are bad and ill-advised, but that he was purposefully and actively trying to weaken the United States so the Soviet Union could take it over. And the Republican Party, at this point in time, lionized Joe McCarthy. They saw that he was winning elections. He was winning elections for other Republicans, and he was exploiting fear and unease that had set upon America in the post-war period with Cold War tensions and this new thing we had, we were coming to grips with, nuclear terror and the prospect of a nuclear war. He was both encouraging and exploiting that fear amongst millions of Americans, and he was telling them something that wasn't true. And most Republicans knew that George C. Marshall was not running a plot, but they went along, and it was very, very effective. Now, in the 70 years since then,
let me interrupt you if I can, because what I found so stunning about that history, that chapter of yours, is that here is Dwight Eisenhower, right, running for president on a train with Joe McCarthy in Wisconsin, and Eisenhower, who was Marshall's buddy, who appointed Marshall Secretary of Defense, who served with him in World War II, and Eisenhower caved and refused to criticize Joe McCarthy or defend Marshall against him.
Right. In fact, it's one of my favorite stories in the book. They're on a train together campaigning in Wisconsin, whistle stopping. McCarthy was up for re-election at the same time as Eisenhower was running for election in 1952 for president. And Eisenhower hated the fact that McCarthy was going after his good friend, George Marshall, his comrade from the days in World War II. And he asked a speechwriter to put a paragraph in his big speech at the end of this tour that was going to be at Marquette University, which is where McCarthy went to school and law school. He asked him to put in a paragraph that basically attacked McCarthy, though not by name, and defended Marshall. It was a little bit oblique, but everybody would have known
Right.
that this was an attack on McCarthy, and Eisenhower distancing himself. On the train that afternoon, as it was chugging through Wisconsin, the Republican governor of Wisconsin, the head of the Republican Party, the RNC, and Sherman Adams, the Republican governor of New Hampshire, who was Dwight Eisenhower's chief of staff, saw this draft and they freaked out. He said, you can't do this. McCarthy is one of the leaders of the party, but we need Wisconsin to win the election. And more importantly, perhaps, McCarthy had helped the Republican Party win over Catholic voters. He was Catholic, of course, and Catholics had primarily been in the Democratic column for decades for all sorts of historical reasons. But because of McCarthy's virulent anti-communism, Catholics were drawn to the man. And if Eisenhower attacked McCarthy, that would alienate voters in Wisconsin, they believed, and alienate Catholic voters across the country. They went to him and said, you can't do this. He looked at them and he said, okay, take it out. And then he gave a speech that night that the Milwaukee Journal said was light McCarthyism. It was basically echoing McCarthy's charges, a little less pointed and not naming names. Yeah. So he totally caved. And, in the years since then, every Republican president or a presidential candidate has in some way or another made a devil's deal. Sometimes they haven't seen it that way. Sometimes they wanted to do it with right-wing extremism, whether it was Nixon and the Southern strategy and making a deal with segregationists, or whether it was Ronald Reagan embracing the moral majority at a time when its leaders were literally calling for the execution of homosexuals, of gay Americans, or it was George W. Bush making a deal with the Christian Coalition and Pat Robertson to help him defeat John McCain, the Tea Party and John Boehner, all the way up to Trump. There's always been some element of the Republican Party. This is their dark history, a side that they don't like to talk about, where they've been taking advantage of, capitalizing on far-right resentment, grievance, paranoia, and fear and hatred.
And in fact, you begin the book with a scene from the Republican convention in San Francisco with Nelson Rockefeller standing up and trying to save the party. This is where the Barry Goldwater was nominated, trying to save the party from the John Birch Society, right? But
yes,
same thing.
The John Birch Society was like McCarthyism on steroids. It was founded by a guy who was a crazy lunatic conspiracy theorist, Robert Welch, who believed that the communists had infiltrated virtually every PTA across America, every union shop, every museum, every school, every corporation, and both parties. In fact, he said that Eisenhower was a communist agent being handled by his brother Milton Eisenhower, another secret communist. He was certifiably nuts, and he created the John Birch Society in the late 50s, and by 1964 it had 100,000 or more members, but these members were dedicated foot soldiers in the Barry Goldwater presidential campaign, and they helped Goldwater defeat Nelson Rockefeller, a liberal and moderate Republican, in the Republican presidential primary of that year. And Goldwater, had done all he could for the years prior to that to make sure that they were not excommunicated from the Republican Party. There were moderate Republicans and others who thought that these wackos in the John Birch Society, that the party needed to disavow them and distance itself from them. Goldwater was willing to distance himself from Welch because of Welch's particularly crazy remarks, but he wanted to keep the John Birch Society in the tent and on his side. And he did. It worked. It helped him get the nomination. And at the convention you mentioned in San Francisco, at the Cow Palace in the summer of 1964, the moderate Republicans tried one last stand, and they proposed a platform plank that denounced the extremism of the Communist Party, the Ku Klux Klan, and the John Birch Society.
Right.
And when Nelson Rockefeller went to speak in support of this provision, this resolution, in front of the entire convention, it was a near riot. The delegates and other people in the crowd hooted and jeered at him. They threw stuff at him. Reporters there feared that violence would break out, and they shouted down Rockefeller, and they voted down the measure. They did not want to be on record as denouncing or criticizing the extreme paranoid anti-communism of the John Birch Society. And then a night or two later, Barry Goldwater made his famous speech in which he said extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. So when extremism had become an issue in the campaign and then was an issue at the party convention, I don't know, what's beyond doubling down, tripling down, quarterly down.
Yeah.
He just went all in on being in favor of extremism. And of course, this all led to a disastrous defeat for Goldwater and the Republicans in 1964. But what it did also was to bring all these extremists into the Republican Party. They stayed there. They did the work. They took over party apparatuses across the country, and they were the ones who years later brought about the Reagan Revolution.
Right. And so from Barry Goldwater and Joe McCarthy and the Reagan Revolution, and you got Newt Gingrich, what you're saying is when Trump got there, right, the ground was already plowed, right? The seeds were already planted. It was already fertile soil for Donald Trump to come in and take the extremists from the fringe to center stage.
What he did was to take a long practiced tradition of the Republican Party that they had kept mainly, not all the time, to the side.
Right.
And bring it to the front and center of the stage and put it in the spotlight. Mitt Romney, when he ran, he embraced Donald Trump, who was a birther, and basically said birtherism is fine within the party. So he was trying to, show that he could speak to those people in an indirect way. John Boehner had romanced the Tea Party that had argued, I mean, quite literally, you remember this, we're not that old, that the Tea Party argument was that Barack Obama was literally a secret Muslim socialist born in Kenya who had a secret plan to destroy the U.S. economy so he can impose a totalitarian dictatorship. Glenn Beck said that every night on Fox, and who was on the show with him? John Boehner, other Republicans, Sarah Palin. They were validating and authenticating this crazy conspiracy theory stuff because they wanted these people voting for the Republicans in the midterm election, which they did, and helped elect John Boehner speaker. So this has always been done. Donald Trump just made it the core of his political project. He didn't bother with the niceties of, well, here's my policy plans. Here's what I'm going to do about the infrastructure and taxes and housing and healthcare. No, he just went straight for the fear and the exploitation of grievances and resentments and latching onto that extremist power. Now, it was, I think, an open question when he began whether it would be successful. There's always been different strains within, or I would say there's always been tension within the Republican Party between Republicans who care about policy and want to do things, and conservative things that you and I might disagree with, but that's what they're there for.
Yeah, right.
And Republicans who just want to, do whatever they can to get elected, and if that means exploiting fear and resentments, they'll do that. There's always been that tension there, and often campaigns have had to do both at the same time. Well, Trump just said, screw that.
Yeah.
I'm just going in on the far right extremism. And he embraced Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist. He, when people said, shouted at his rallies, get rid of Muslims, he said, yeah, we're going to look into that. So he just, took what had been done. He did more of it and wasn't shy about it.
Again, we remember this is not that long ago. There were many voices still in the Republican Party as Trump ascended who spoke out against him and warned that this is not where the party should go. Lindsey, you quote this in your book. I've got your book open here, page 287. Lindsey Graham, quote, "We should have basically kicked him out of the party." You've got even Glenn Beck, who said that Trump represented a threat to possible extinction-level event for American democracy and capitalism. So how did Trump succeed in taking over? The party, again, basically just caved?
It's not about Donald Trump. It's about the Republican base, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if Donald Trump, could embrace a conspiracy theorist, he can, promote election denialism, he can incite a riot. And if enough, Republican voters said, that's too much for me, I don't want that crazy, then it wouldn't go anywhere, or it would end, it would peter out. But what, the Republicans discovered, I think to some of their horror, is that what the party had been doing for decades, Donald Trump did so well that it became a core tenet of the Republican base. And, in some ways you can look at what happened with Sarah Palin in 2008, saying, that Barack Obama was not a true American. He didn't understand America, and he was palling around with terrorists. And you had those campaign rallies where people were shouting, kill him, kill him, off with his head. And, and McCain, we liked John McCain in a lot of ways. I knew him. I liked a lot of things about John, but he, went along with that. He did not stop that happening during his campaigns. And that fed into the Tea Party antipathy and fear mongering. And so I think as the Republicans did this over the years, they radicalized the Republican voter. So by the time Trump comes along, he, either recognizes that and intuits that, or, thinks it's that places his money on this bet. And, it's almost an unstoppable force. They want the red meat. They want the extremism. And the rest of the party, which has played footsie with extremism over these years, has lost control. I mean, John Boehner lost control. He had to leave the speakership before the Tea Party, elected Republicans were about to mutiny against him. Mitt Romney, when he ran in 2012, as I said a moment ago, he embraced Donald Trump, this birther, and validated and authenticated him and said he was a legitimate part of the Republican cosmos. And then when Trump becomes, a problem, Mitt Romney tries to speak out against him, but it's too late. Mitt, you help create the monster by telling the base, by signaling to the base that Trump was okay.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.